And I have the pleasure today of chairing today's panel, which I mentioned before is titled Rethinking Canadian and Quebec Undergraduate Survey Course. And I'm extremely excited to introduce the panel speakers today, who will briefly outline their thoughts on the ways we can rethink and reframe Canadian and Quebec history survey courses within both academic institutions and for some in the community as well. And they each have a few minutes to share their pedagogical approaches, as well as their thoughts on how they've shifted the lens of Canadian history through this survey course. And we will open the discussion after for questions from attendees. So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. So our panel speakers today include Laura Ishiguro, who is the Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of British Columbia and specializes in the histories of British Columbia, Canada, and British imperialism in 19th and 20th centuries. Jamie Murton is an Associate Professor in the Department of History at Nipissing University, focusing on the environmental history of food and agriculture, and particularly that of substance production and its relationship to capitalist markets for food. Angela Tozer is the Assistant Professor in the Department of History at the University of New Brunswick, whose research explores the relationship between capitalism and settler colonialism in 19th century Canada. Dominique Marshall is a professor of history at Carleton University, where her scholarship focuses on social policy, children's rights, humanitarian aid, refugees, disability, and technology. Mark Leier is a professor in the Department of History at Simon Fraser University, whose research intersects with the history of anarchism, as well as labor and contemporary issues. And finally, we have Mike Dawson, who is a professor of history at St. Thomas University, where his research and teaching emphasizes courses on Canadian history, the global history of sport and tourism, and the relationship between history, entertainment, and popular culture. So all of this is to say that you are in good company with these brilliant scholars and educators who are thinking about how we write and construct and conceive of the Canadian History Survey course. So I've been told that I've been given a strict timeline for which to keep you all on. So I have my timer going, but I will send you private messages if you are nearing that point or you've gone over your time and you might need a little nudge to get back into the conversation. But really looking forward to hearing this discussion about what your thoughts are on the Canadian and Quebec History Survey course. So Laura, how about you get us started on your thoughts?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Funké. So good Pacific Mountain and Central morning and good afternoon, Eastern Atlantic and Newfoundland folks. My name is Laura Ishiguro, and I'm speaking to you today from the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. This is land that I've occupied for about a decade, where I've been living and working at UBC Vancouver. And today I'm speaking about Canadian history, teaching, and learning in this place. And I want to start by saying that 7 minutes is not enough for me to say anything at all. My initial attempt to introduce myself was 7 minutes. So I'm not really speaking to a lot of the big questions in my initial comments. I've interpreted my role here very narrowly, and I'm going to describe one specific course a little bit, gesture to some of its larger implications in the hopes of opening our conversation and offering one example. This course is a shared project of the core Canadianist faculty in the Department of History at UBC Vancouver. And so in some senses, I'm speaking today as just one of that team. But my disclaimer is that I don't represent their views, and I'm very much speaking also from my own position, my own understanding of teaching and learning in history, and as the one who designed and ran the course for its first 2 years in practice. I do want to acknowledge the role of Tamara Myers in writing the original curriculum proposal, which came out of our collective conversations. So this course is our introduction to Canadian history, the so-called new History 235, although it's actually not that new anymore. Our redesign process began 9 years ago, and it began not with a historical, historiographical, or pedagogical impulse, but rather an administrative decree. At the time, we had a 2-term survey-style introduction to Canadian history, and we were told we were not allowed to have a 2-term course anymore. So we had a lot of choices, including simply splitting it in half. But in our conversations together, we decided to do something different. The result is a one-term course that at its core is premised on the idea that an introduction to Canadian history doesn't need to be a survey or pretend to coverage, but rather that there are other ideas, skills, and ways of thinking about Northern North America that are perhaps just as or more generative and significant at the introductory level. I will note here that I have a bunch of old syllabi on my website, which includes the first two versions of 235. It's changed since then. It'll definitely change when it's back in my hands again. But if you are interested in looking in more detail, those are available to you online. In my introduction now, though, I'll say that there's two main features that define this course. The first is its central organizing principle. Each element of the course design is rooted in a single shared question. What moments have mattered in Canada's history and why? Each lecture makes a case. It picks a moment and it explains it in context with evidence, and in the process models developing historical arguments to make a case for its significance. The regular coursework and assignments build on this as students use the question to guide reading and discussion, and then implement and explore the question in their own research in independent projects as well. Now, I have lots to say about the discussion in general and what this particular question and the moments framing both does and doesn't do. But for me, I do want to note that it does, I think, some good, important work in a number of different directions. One of those is as an introduction to critical historical thinking and analysis. This is one way to render history in general and Canadian history in particular as not just something that's passively received or a kind of coverage of a bunch of stuff that's happened, but it really brings history alive as perspective and interpretation, what mattered and matters, for whom and how we go about measuring significance and talk about it well. The other core principle of the course is that it's team taught, or a version of something we might call team teaching. Now, I'll acknowledge here that my department doesn't actually allow for team teaching in a sense that we share credit in our course load. So there is only one instructor of record each year who designs, coordinates, does the bulk of the work, and is present in the course throughout the term. But the lectures are given by all core members of the Canadianist faculty in the department each year, plus other colleagues and sometimes graduate students and others. Based on our own expertise, we choose our own moments that we think matter, and we make our own arguments for them. And again, I think this has lots of impacts, including students understanding that there is no single version of Canadian history and why it matters. The faculty in my department certainly do not all agree on the question and its answers, and I think for students, this can be productive. Rather than one voice or emphasis that purports to authority or coverage, students engage with different approaches and perspectives, as well as, I think, strategically hearing from each of us at our best at the introductory level. This, of course, has complications and challenges too, but for me, they've been generally navigable, not always as much of a problem as they might seem, and I don't think they necessarily discount the pedagogical and history value of this approach. Before I conclude, though, I do want to acknowledge two considerations with this kind of revisioning and implementation. One is that it front loads a bunch of additional labor. Our actual calendar description of the course does have lots of flexibility for this approach, but our approach with the core tenure track and tenured faculty did involve a lot of work up front, and we do now have a system that largely runs. But depending on the details, I think this kind of revisioning could be a choice or have the potential to call instructors to do significant work, including before a teaching contract begins or above and beyond a contract. The other point I want to raise is about articulation. My department's Canadian history curriculum maps, quite frankly, very poorly onto the other offerings of other institutions in British Columbia, including that we do have shorter chronological survey style courses at the 300 level. They're just not our introduction. And so at the very least, this raises transfer credit questions as students move between institutions in the province. Other than that, of course, there's larger questions to raise and implications for teaching and learning in Canadian history, but I promise I'm concluding here. I want to say here's one example. Were I reimagining it on my own or doing it now, this isn't exactly what I would do. And I don't actually see this as a radical departure, for better or for worse, but rather as a kind of reorganizing of teaching Canadian history that centers significant skill building and understanding of Canadian history as something that's alive and matters in the stories that we tell of it. And I hope that this example offers something generative in our conversation today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Laura. And right on time. Look, my timer just went off. It's awesome. Thank you so much. And I think that up next, I have Jamie.
Thanks. Thanks for coming, everyone, and thanks for the invitation to speak. I am coming to you from the territory of the Nabizing Anishinaabe, or Nipissing First Nation, lands protected by the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850, and I'm grateful to be here. So I wanted to talk to you today about my answer to some of the problems of the Canadian survey, which is a first-year course that I've called The Idea of Canada. And the course tries to do a number of things. It tries, as Laura was saying, it tries to pack the history of Canada into one term, which I don't know that I quite successfully managed to do that. But in the interest of making a clear contribution to the discussion here, I want to focus on the one major thing I was trying to do with the course. So this was fashioning a course that would address a problem of relevancy that I think plagues a traditional survey by trying to offer solutions to, or at least kind of contextualize current issues and problems. And there's a couple of inspirations for this. So I was at a niche network in Canadian history of environment, hosted discussion a few years ago. And at that, the idea came up that one reason for the relative lack of history majors these days is that students are looking for answers to problems and that they don't perceive history to be a place to get these answers. And I think that kind of rings true to me, or that rang true to me. And then as the state of things began to turn increasingly dark as the pandemic rolled on, I wanted to create a course that would take Canadian political and economic institutions seriously, that would give students some context on Canadian institutions and how they work and where they don't work. So I framed the class around the idea that Canada is a project of British colonialism. So the idea that it's a project of British colonialism that selectively built on, exploited, and worked to destroy what preceded the start of British rule in the mid-1700s. So the environment, Indigenous nations, existing colonial settlements. And I then cut the class up into modules. So the idea being, one reason for this was I wanted to be able to pull out and drop in different topics in the future as different things became relevant. For the module or unit on colonialism, I started with a detailed discussion of the current dispute over the Coastal GasLink natural gas pipeline and the opposition to it led by hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en. Because the project is supported by a number of band councils in the region, and it led to Canada-wide protests in 2020, I could then ask questions like, why are there two different chiefs or sets of chiefs in Wet'suwet'en territory? What is meant by unceded land? Why the claim that the government of British Columbia has no authority in Wet'suwet'en territory? And then sort of pushing beyond that, right? Why does BC claim it has authority in this territory? And what was it about this dispute that led to Indigenous people across Canada to come out in support? And then what I did was I then looped back into the past to sort of answer these questions. So I started with an examination of the doctrine of discovery, recently in the news, of course, which I knew was being cited more and more by Indigenous activists and scholars, and I was very keen to explain to my students. I then moved forward examining the Treaty of Niagara as an actual basis for settler Canada and a model for how relations could be between settlers and Indigenous nations, this idea of an Indigenous crown relationship based on peace, friendship, and respect. And this then meant that we could talk about treaties and the principles behind treaties. And we could see how treaties were something that Indigenous leaders had long seen as a basis for a relationship with Canada, and that they were often rooted in these Niagara principles. They weren't something that simply came up in 1969 with the white paper, right? As readings, I gave students the treaty documents assembled in Sean Courage and Tom Peace's great online collection of primary sources for Canadian history. this unit of the course worked really well. I think it let us focus on this history, rather than having it get buried in a variety of other events, which is what often happens with the traditional chronological survey, right? And it also meant that I could decenter Canada, even while we are working to understand Canada today. In the traditional survey, moving chronologically through time, Canada always ultimately ends up as the center of the narrative, but here colonial relationships could be the center. A couple of things. A major source for me was the work of the political scientist Peter H. Russell, who spent many years thinking about through these issues, thinking about the way to properly conduct relations between Indigenous nations in Canada. And I highly recommend his book, Constitutional Odyssey, if folks have not read it. I also came to appreciate the extent to which Indigenous scholars have been thinking about how Canada works and how it could work better. So think about the work of John Burroughs here, for instance. And I need to read more of this kind of work as I work on the course. Finally, the other units in the course didn't work quite as well. Students are actually quite primed to discuss Canadian colonialism. They know about it. This is encouraging, I think, in and of itself. They struggled with the unit on the history of parliamentary democracy. And I think not just because I went back to the English Civil War, but it's a perennial problem in the survey. I think I find students often are not comfortable in or have little grasp of how electoral politics works, and so have trouble grasping the intricacies of how governments are formed and dissolved, for instance. So I think I was trying to work on that. I'm not sure I entirely got there. And finally, another issue is that in none of the modules did I manage to actually get back to the present. So the original idea was I would go back into the past and then come right back up to the issue I'd started with. And in fact, I never got past about the 1960s. But I managed to sort of make that work. As it turns out, and I guess I didn't mean to. I was thinking about what Laura said, and I didn't mean to necessarily go for comprehensiveness. And I think I kind of fell into doing that and then found it a little hard to achieve. So anyways, but overall, I'm happy with this approach. I hope it makes history useful to students and not in a way that overly simplifies the historical story. My sense is that there's lots of people out there now sort of telling historical stories that connect to contemporary problems, and they often they're not done in the way in which I think we would like, and I'm trying to do something a little different here. I'm planning on refining this as I teach the course in the future. There's some other things I did in the course to do with the teaching of primary sources, for instance, or thinking about what to say about how to think about Canada as a nation or a nation state today. And I'd be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie. And I believe next is Angela.
Hi, so my presentation is titled, What's in a Name? Titling the Canadian History Survey. I'm Angela Tozer, Assistant Professor at the History Department at the University of New Brunswick, and I'm speaking to you today from the territory of the Wolastoqey Nation, covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship. So this art piece that you see here, I hope, is by Marie Nicholson, who is Zalwe Danua from King Cum Inlet. And she says of her piece, quote, in 21st century protests over land jurisdiction, some First Nations reclaimed the British flag's original version as an assertion of Indigenous land rights and the unresolved issue they constitute. So the flag changed from the sun over the Union Jack to the sun under the Union Jack to reflect, quote, the sun never setting on the British Empire. And she says, in my version, RCMP tunic buttons along the Union Jack's horizontal line represent the, quote, legal imposition of colonial authority. The sun is given its original position above the British flag, and in the text in Chinook jargon reads, the sun is setting on the British Empire. So for me, Nicholson's artwork captures several significant factors about Canadian history that I explore in my Intro to Canada survey course: how to frame European imperialism, what happens when the sun sets on the British Empire for Canada, which is usually marked, of course, as happening of July 1st, 1867. What happens on the other side of 1867? Where does imperialism go? Does it just disappear on the horizon with the setting sun? So in this talk, I wanted to focus on what I struggled with specifically with renaming the Canadian survey at UNB in the history department. And it took me several months, full disclosure, even a year to put the renaming proposal into our department to be set off to the machine of the university, because basically I couldn't decide on what to title it. So retitling the Canadian History Survey opened up many issues for me. One in particular, can we even teach Canadian history without reproducing colonial narratives? So the first issue has to do with the reification of the Canadian state as existing as a stable political entity. And we see this in this kind of pre-post 1867 division of intro courses that was alluded to. So pre-Confed is usually taught in the fall or the first half, post-Confed taught in the winter. This is my experience as an undergrad, and this is how I taught it as well. So this confederation as a line of demarcation, however, suggests to students that there was something Canadian about the 1860s at all, and it loses the colonial history of Canada on the other side of confederation, as if poof, on July 1st, 1867, colonialism just stopped. So the other issue that you find even in critical histories about Canadian settler colonialism is this binary narrative where Canada is understood as this binary relationship between what was called Native newcomer studies or settler indigenous now, which for me partially reflected this reluctance to name white supremacy, or specifically Canada's position within the global history of white supremacy, because it is a global history. So for example, last year or 2 years ago, there's a philosophy professor at U of T, and he put out this op-ed, I think, to the Toronto Star. I should have checked before I started this talk, where he argued that we need to rename the term BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And his argument was basically like that BIPOC isn't useful in the Canadian context. Unlike the United States, Canada does not have a large enough Black population or demographic to support this term BIPOC. So he wanted to drop the B. And there's many other instances of this logic that erases Black history in particular. So I wrote recently in a book review for the CHR that all Canadian history is a part of Indigenous history, but not all Indigenous history is a part of Canadian history. And I want to push this a bit further here to say that Canadian history is a part of this global history of white supremacy. Writing about race within this history is meaningless without the concurrent analysis of the structures of white supremacy. I mean, what is Confederation if not the ascendancy of the white settler body politic? So doing histories of marginalized peoples and Indigenous peoples separate from an understanding of Indigenous nations and governance systems within the frame of Canada, I'd argue here both assimilates the histories of those folks into the narrow confines of the structure of, quote, Canada, and cannot account for the structures of the Canadian state built for, by, and to support white supremacy. It is white supremacy that allows for the legitimization of Europeans as sovereigns over the territories of Indigenous nations. So we have the Scottish-born, I believe, Glasgow-born, first Prime Minister John A. Macdonald as this authority over Canada in 1867. So in particular, histories such as those in Black studies can exist without needing to, of course, justify itself, without having to be called on by white historians in particular to count the number of Black folks who live in Canada to be considered a real history. Black studies should be central to Canadian history for its own sake, but also because without an understanding of Black history, we cannot understand white supremacy. And without centering white supremacy, race as legal, cultural, social, economic system of oppression in its contemporary and historical manifestation has no meaning. So how did I get, or I should say, how am I attempting to get out of this binary logic in Canadian history as one between Indigenous and settler that can easily, very easily cut out Black history in particular and histories of race and power? And I'm thinking here of Ikoyo Day's concept of race and settler colonies, not as this Enlightenment hierarchy or this great chain of being, but instead she argues that in the settler colonies, race is a triad with Indigenous, settler, and alien as each point in the triangle, with land in the middle, and people are racialized based on ownership rights, land ownership rights. So to me, Canada is an imperialist project. And 1867 marked when the imperial authority was passed from Britain to Canada. So what did I end up calling my survey course? Oh, I did a really slow fade. Okay, Canada, empires and imperialism. So for me, this title does away with this pre-Confed Canada, which is not a thing. It is anachronistic, obviously, but also supports this narrative of a reified Canadian state almost outside of history when we start talking about pre-Confederation Canada. So in our course, we look at 1867 as a transfer of imperial power from Britain to Canada. In this way, I ask students to examine Canada as interacting with specific Indigenous nations, not just this universalized category of Indigenous people. When we perceive settler colonialism as only Canadian state policy directed towards Indigenous peoples, generally this narrative frame captures Indigenous peoples as being within the state logic and normalizes Canada as the natural sovereign over its claimed geographical space. It also plays into the state's universalizing logic of Indigenous peoples as one population within the state to be managed, and erases the sovereignty and, importantly, the jurisdiction of Indigenous nations over their territory. So, for example, the jurisdiction of the Mi'kmaq Nation over fisheries. And as Sherry Pasternak points out, it is jurisdiction that is central to settler colonialism, the refusal of the Canadian state to obey the laws of Indigenous nations, and instead criminalizing treaty rights in the case of maritime fisheries. So I end my first part of the course temporally in 1876 with the Indian Act as a sort of point that marks the ascension of the Canadian settler state. The word empire here in the title for me also captures that pre-1867 period of British-French empires and can examine the interaction between European empires and Indigenous nations. So for me, empires and imperialism captures both sides of confederation, so to speak, without centering confederation. In this way, we can see confederation and the structures of white supremacy when British men specifically took over the imperial project from Britain in the British North American colonies, a transfer of imperial power that I teach reached its concretized form with the 1876 Indian Act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. And up next, we have Dominique.
Hello, everyone. So thank you for the challenge of talking in 7 minutes about undergraduate surveys. So I'm going to do 1 minute for 7 things in 7 minutes. The first thing would be the context of what I'm doing. Then I'm going to talk about the world in Canada or transnational dimensions of it. Then the many types of relations to the past that my students have. And then I'm going to talk about mastering the content, not being intimidated by history. 5th, learning by doing. 6th, talking about skills and tools. And 7, talking about learning laterally and vertically. So for the context, apologies, I was a bad student. I didn't know I could talk about the Quebec History Survey. I returned to survey teaching 2 years ago. Coincidence that it was the pandemic, because that was decided a year before. I taught twice the Quebec History Survey. I was hired to do that way back then, and I returned to it after years of not teaching it, partly because students are now interested for all the nasty reasons. You know, French Canadians are racist, the Catholic Church is awful, and there's nothing about fairness over there. And it's a kind of a black mirror of Indigenous history. And also, I returned to the survey by interest, but also because of the presence of very much better textbooks. And also the propaganda, I have to say, and I'll thank him, of Sean Courage, who tirelessly, from one conference to the next, promotes beautiful ways and interesting ways of teaching the survey. So I hope I can return the favor today and maybe inspire a few people. The survey at Carleton is divided in 2, and it's called Early and Modern, and Rethinking, Modern, and Conflicts and Change in Early. So we try to avoid the names that were just discussed. And I tried when I was doing it, and I'm teaching it online, asynchronous, and I'm still doing that this year, even if we can go back to face-to-face. And what's behind the way I thought about it is the way I've been teaching at a graduate level and the way I've been teaching thematical courses and what worked well there. Also, my own research. So trying to put as much of what I do in what I teach, and modeling being a historian. So the first theme is the world in Canada. So what is Canadian history? Same as my colleague before. to whom does Canadian history belong? Many people in Ottawa, and even more larger proportion in my class, were not born in Canada, or their parents were not born in Canada. So I have people who did high school in Haiti, Syria, Ethiopia, and I'm telling them you don't need to know anything of it, and what you know about your own high school teaching would be great to bring. And the example here is World War I. Where were your ancestors in World War I? So is the history of Canadians the history of those who were there in Canada in World War I, or is the history of Canadians the history of the ancestors of those who are now in Canada? And so there are very interesting moments like World War I where I can deal with these ideas in very interesting way. The third thing is the many relationships to the past. So there is academic history, and that's with its specific canons, peer reviews, fact-based, and then there is the history you learn by traveling, from your family, from TV, from fiction. And I try to place that history and to validate the others, and again, in a way, tapping on the fascination that the students have for Indigenous history and teaching from elders. The fourth thing is not to be intimidated. And I do not, like Jamie said, I promise a comprehensive class, and also Laura. So I'm saying by the time you're finished, you're gonna know at a superficial level, and with that great Belshaw, online free textbook, you're gonna do all the important debates, all the important themes. You're gonna be able to search it quickly. You're gonna know the whole thing at the first level. And so I really have a challenge there, and I'm telling them how to read that thing, how to take their notes, how to be able to do this in so much time, and how to tell, do not be intimidated by this. Go from, you'll be able to distinguish the forest from the tree, start from the big things, take your notes smaller, and master that content. I'm trying to do that. Fifth, learning by doing. So a lot of do as I do. So I see them all one by one in the middle of the term, and I look at their proposal for their own research, and I bring them all up to par so that they can start with all the good proposals by the end of the meeting. And I show them how I use America history and life and whatever to make sure that they have the basis covered. The skills and tools, I am also telling them by the time you finish, because most of the class for structural programmatic things I can explain are not history major. By the time you get out of there, you know all the important tools in Canadian history: the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, the Canadian Encyclopedia, Historical Statistics of Canada, the Historical Atlas of Canada. You know it all. And my exam is what I'm telling them all the time. Your boss one day tells you, in one day, give me a history of X, and do your best in one day, and you will be able to do your best. You will know where to look, and you'll be able to produce it. So my exam is take one day and use what you learn, and take one of the questions in the textbook of Belshaw, which is not linked to your term paper, and write a report. And I tell them what to do: a chronology, a list of bibliographies, and all that. And then the last one is pedagogy. So a lot of them want to be teachers. A lot of them are very impressed by ways by which elders teach younger people in Indigenous communities. And a lot of them are happy to teach each other. So I show everyone what everyone is working on, so they know which term paper they are doing. And so they look at what each other is doing. They look at my comments on the others. And also I give a lot of leeway to my TAs and to our undergraduate student partners, which is a very nice program, to design their own module in order to teach people that are closer to the students in a way that is more intergenerational. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dominique. And up next, I have Mark.
Thank you. I attended a seminar on designing courses where each of us was asked to suggest one thing we thought a survey course should do. The list ranged from general academic skills to historical craft to interpretations to events. It was a great list, but the sheer number of things was daunting. Worse, nothing on the list ever helps me deal with the response I get when I ask students for one word to describe what they think or what they feel about Canadian history. For years now, the survey response is always, they find Canadian history boring. They're not bored because of the subject matter, of the material, or how it's taught. They find Canadian history boring because however creatively it has been presented and taught, they know it's largely propaganda. They may not articulate this, but they know it. Students are unlikely to confront this directly because they are stuck in the course. And when education contradicts our own experience of the world, the result is often not resistance, but paralysis. Propaganda, after all, often works by creating contradictory notions, a mental gridlock. Thus, however skeptical students might be, the dead weight of constant propaganda. Johnny MacDonald is a man of great vision and foresight. Wilfrid Laurier is the builder of an inclusive, united, and free Canada, drags them down. This is what they bring to the course long before they sign up for it. But students still understand, even if they don't react to it, they understand they are subject to arbitrary authority. After all, every student that we face has a huge example of that, their parents. So they face arbitrary authority at home, at school, at work, and at university. And despite our best intentions, we often represent just another arbitrary authority. To the degree that education and history takes place in a hierarchy with rewards and punishment, and at SFU, every course outline has a threat about academic dishonesty attached to it by the university. To the degree that education and history has rewards and punishments, I think it's a good sign that people recognize education and history as propaganda. They recognize it, they resent it, and resist it. That resistance, however, often resembles the classic responses to threats: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And so their resistance manifests itself in the belief that Canadian history is boring. It's not because of the subject, it's not because of the material, not because of the pedagogy, but because it is imposed from above by the media and by the schools. I've tried to take advantage of this resistance by designing the Canadian survey around one concept that I share with students in our very first class, and that is shit flows downhill. History is the study of how it flows, who pours, and who fights back. It's a concept people understand immediately from their own experience. Thinking of Canadian history in this sense gives it a new coherence and a framework to understand how those with power got it, keep it, and use it. And it lets us use history to shift the blame pattern upwards. That is, students' own life is very much about having the blame pattern go downwards. You've all heard of the kick the cat syndrome. The employee gets yelled at by the boss, the employee goes home, yells at their spouse, the spouse yells at the kid kicks the cat. But we need to shift that blame pattern upward. Now, we have a great starting point, which is the history that people have already been taught. Why would we do that? Why would we start with all the old muck? Because people take on new ideas slowly and carefully and uneasily. If we dismiss and discount what they already know, we're just going to be another arbitrary authority, and students will respond in the same ways: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Canadian history is boring. We start with where they are because, let's face it, 50 years of the new social history has not made much of a dent in the popular culture. Students still come to my class with the old narrative firmly fixed, however skeptical or blasé or cynical they may be about it. We are always outnumbered and outgunned by capital and the state. So my task is not to insist that they replace everything they know with the great new stuff I'm giving them. That just makes me another arbitrary authority. My task is to try to build on what students know or think they know and use the momentum of our opponents of capital and the state against them. Luckily, our opponents make it very easily. John A. Macdonald, of course, was quick to say we want an elected Senate because we fear the power of the people. George Brown announced that it is an empire we have in view. We take that work, we reinterpret the standard histories to understand and help students understand that shit flows downhill. The good news is students are already hip to this. They don't need to be taught it, they just need to be allowed to see it and express it. When I survey my students, the students in the survey course are closer in their politics to Emma Goldman and Noam Chomsky than they are to the liberals and conservatives. They already know that shit flows downhill. And when we acknowledge this, when we acknowledge it and use it to reframe the history, they can take it and are pleased to run with it and invent it themselves. I'd also add in this task that we have youth and hope on our side. Not our youth, not our hope perhaps, but theirs. Aristotle noted, the young would always rather do noble deeds than useful ones. And that is a great thing to have on our side. It encourages us to approach teaching history not as academics in a discipline, but as organizers who start with people where they are and give them tools to open up the future. And that seems like a good thing for a post-Canadian survey course to do. But I think that it starts with that overarching concept that shit flows downhill. And that's necessary and crucial for any other innovations that we want to make in terms of how we teach, what precisely we teach, timelines or whatever. Shit flows downhill. It's where I start, and I guess where I'll end right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And last but not least, Mike.
Great. Thanks very much. Just checking my time there. Welcome back to the unceded territory of the Wistupwiyuk, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy peoples. So about 15 years ago, I started to reinvent the traditional survey here at STU, and we rebranded it the Historical Roots of Contemporary Canada. This is going to be modeled ideally on a book that Catherine Gidney and I are supposed to be writing, called 20 Questions and Answers About Canadian History, but that got interrupted by a fairly long spell in a university administration. But we're back in the saddle now, and hopefully we'll make some progress. So what we did here is basically sacrificed a certain amount of comprehensiveness and aimed for engagement. And so, like Jamie, there's an element of this approach. I guess the parallel is Law and Order, where we're ripping things from the headlines and using that to explore historical issues. So I basically divided the course into two parts. The first part of the course provides a very concise narrative history from the Big Bang to last Thursday, which is sort of 6 to 8 classes in total. Bird's eye view lectures. I use some timeline software to orient students regarding key periods, transitions, events, and that sort of thing. And then the second part of the course, we slow it down, and it's shaped entirely by thematic lectures. All right, so they've got the context under their belt in the first, 3 weeks or so. And then we focus on these thematic lectures that are shaped by very rhetorical questions that speak consistently to contemporary concerns, but also to what I think are important historical issues. So, for example, some of the questions that we that structure this core part of the course: what was the Quiet Revolution? How might hockey explain its significance? When and how did Canada become bilingual and multicultural? We leverage the old Stephen Harper quote. So there's a question that I use called, does Canada have a history of colonialism? And then we use it to understand the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state. We have a question called, why do school textbooks focus so much on the Underground Railroad? So exploring slavery and anti-Black racism in Canada. How has the fight for women's rights in Canada changed over time? When, how, and why did Canada develop a welfare state? Why are those guys in cowboy hats so angry? So that explores the history of Western alienation. We've got a question on best friend or troublesome neighbor, examining Canada's obsession with the United States. What's the deal with government liquor stores? A brief history of alcohol consumption and regulation Canada, and so on. Huh? So to enhance as best I can this experience, I've been using student response technology. So we do some online quizzes with some software, free software called Presentria. And then I do some real-time polling and some question and answer scenarios with some software called Mentimeter. And the quizzes, I think, help the students. They're pretty straightforward, short answer or multiple choice questions that at the end of the lecture, if the lecture ends on we did the lecture on the Tuesday, before the next lecture on the Thursday, they just have to go through and answer the 5 short questions. Gives them a chance to process what the key points were in the material that was presented. For the Mentimeter software, at the end of every class on Moodle, which is our online classroom software that we use, I'll give them the opportunity to, I'll just ask a broad question, which is do you have any questions or comments you'd like to make about today's lesson? Obviously, during the lectures, there'll be students that are comfortable enough raising their hand or barking out a question or a comment, but I've got a lot of students that aren't comfortable doing that. So this gives them an opportunity to ask a question. I can go into more detail, helps me out a little bit. I can see what the questions are before I walk into the classroom the next time. And that allows us to get a little bit more comprehensive than I would probably be able to be, because there's just an opportunity to add on some discussion to what I've already planned to be doing. Yeah, so that's kind of, and then the Mentimeter's software also allows me to poll the students. So I can poll them in advance before we get to the section on Canadian-American relations. I might poll them in advance, 5 or 6 questions, get their views on cultural issues, on cross-border shopping, on Canadian television programs versus American television programs, and then I can incorporate that polling data into my slides during the lectures. So I get to incorporate some of their subject positions into the material that I'm working. Again, trying to get for as much engagement as possible. So that's kind of the structure of the course. One thing I'll just talk about really briefly is one thing that I've always struggled with is just the nature of the assignments. I've always been fairly confident in terms of what I've been doing in terms of the material. I've struggled for a long time to get comfortable with the kinds of assignments that I use. I've struggled to settle on assignments that I think that are really engaging students. So obviously there are the quizzes that help with the lecture material. There's a final exam that helps to bring some of the broader themes together. For the essays, in the old days, I would assign book reviews, ditched that a long time ago. Now I tend to use very accessible readings that students can use to incorporate into their essays on secondary sources. And then the second assignment is usually primary sources, where I'll give them a set of 10 or 12 newspaper articles, say from 1992, so they can look at what was going on with the Canada 125 celebrations, and they can use that to explore key themes that we've looked at in the course. But the other thing I'm doing, and this is the last point that's a little different this year, I piloted this in a couple of other courses. I teach a course on Disney and world history and another one on tourism and world history. And it worked really well. And I've created a sort of a conversation initiative. So it gives the students, it's a short 5% assignment, pretty much pass fail, minimal risk, where they choose any topic at all related to Canadian history, broadly construed. They go online, find some sort of resource, newspaper article, blog post, doesn't matter. They write up a 300-word commentary, they email it to me, and then we have a 5 to 10 minute conversation. It can be in person, it can be online via Teams, doesn't much matter. And we use this both as an opportunity, give them an opportunity to explore something that they want to know more about from the course, or something we haven't been able to cover. It helps me get a sense of my students, helps me tweak the lectures in future years. But the other thing it does is it gives these students, some of whom don't have a lot of confidence, an opportunity to get some practice how to email a professor, have some confidence in going through a 5 to 10 minute conversation that hopefully pays off further down the road. This is a second year course, hopefully pays off in third and fourth year. You know, just giving them confidence if they need to go and ask for an extension, or if they need clarification for something, they're more comfortable with me. Ideally, they're more comfortable with their other professors as well. So that in a nutshell is what we're doing with History 2913, the historical roots of contemporary Canada.